And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Norbert Gleicher, who will be speaking to us on, is the immune system, that is, autoimmunity and inflammation, really irrelevant to IVF success, as suggested by some?
Hello again. And it is wonderful to see so many of you still here, I must say. So, you may have noticed that Andrea's talk kind of quietly moved our theme towards the immune system. And this is the topic of my first and later presentation today. And it is already a main topic in next year's conference, so those of you who are planning on coming to see us next year. And the reason is that we think it is the forgotten piece in reproductive biology. And it is suddenly being talked about. You don't hear it yet, you don't see it yet in publications, but I can tell you that most of the major reproductive biology laboratories, you have heard their representatives here mostly on the first day, they all have started talking again about the immune system. And, once they start talking about it, you can bet that within a year you will start seeing some very interesting studies in the literature. And I think this is just yet one other theme that is on the verge of finally making some major progress. Conflict statement, nothing in reference to this talk. I will be talking to you a little bit about the history of reproductive immunology, autoimmunity and reproductive failure, which Andrea already so well prepared in her talk, how we went wrong for a long, long time, the fact that the fetus is really a semi-allograft and allograft, kind of a solid organ transplant that a woman receives from her partner. The concept of tolerance, which we feel is absolutely essential for reproductive success, and which is that forgotten piece in reproductive biology for too long. And the effects of a hyperactive immune system on the ability of a woman to develop tolerance. And finally, I will show you some pretty amazing recent data outside of our field, which provide very convincing evidence that tolerance pathways need to be induced in order to have successful reproduction. So quick historical review. Reproductive immunology, in other words, the recognition that an implanting embryo is really a transplant, first became apparent with the historical work of Medawar and Billingham. Medawar won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology for some of his groundbreaking transplantation work. Billingham, apropos, was a founding member in 1979 of the American Society for Reproductive Immunology, and that society was founded just a few blocks away from here at Mount Sinai. In my last year of residency, when I organized a reproductive immunology meeting there, and Billingham was in attendance. Founding of that society was a historical point because it, for the first time, pointed toward the immune system and its importance in reproductive success. But then something very interesting happened. investigators from New Zealand, under the leadership of Lubbe, made the first association between abnormal autoimmunity and reproductive failure, in this case, miscarriages. They reported that the presence of what was called a lupus anticoagulant, which is really basically an antiphospholipid antibody, was statistically highly associated with miscarriages. And Lubbe was not an OBGYN, he was not a fertility doctor, he was an internist. And the observation was made because he, as a coincidence, at the same time on a large ward, had 3 patients with blood clotting disorders, with thrombosis, who also had a history of multiple miscarriages. So it was a real coincidence that all of these patients came together, that he noticed it, etc. That's how the association of autoimmunity with miscarriages was for the first time noticed. I was still very young in those days, but we picked immediately up on this work and shortly afterwards published a paper in JAMA where we showed that it is not only lupus anticoagulant, but autoimmunity in general. And that has been kind of the theme for many years that has been dominating reproductive immunology. A few years later, Geva and Associates from Israel then made the association, excuse me, that autoimmunity appears also associated with implantation failure. And even though that is now widely accepted, the data is still somewhat sparse. In other words, it is not as robust as the association with miscarriage risk. Now, unfortunately, then something happened that is happening in medicine quite frequently. Once the association of autoimmunity with reproductive failure was recognized, suddenly a number of colleagues who worked in this field saw a commercial opportunity and started opening labs to test for those antibodies. Does that sound familiar? It's happening in all fields of medicine, unfortunately. And what then happens is that those interests, consciously or subconsciously, start exaggerating the need for these tests, and highly exaggerated claims were indeed made. And the industry pushed and pushed and pushed so that all of us do more and more of these tests. And we came to a point where suddenly everything was autoimmune. And as so often happened, the next thing was the backlash. And then Hill and Scott published this famous paper, Infertility and Sterility, and to a degree they were right. But to another degree, they represented the pendulum swinging to the other extreme, and obviously extremes are never good. And so what happened as a consequence, reproductive immunology kind of disappeared in perjury over the next 20 years. And you will agree with me that that we have seen and heard relatively little over the next 20 years about reproductive immunology. And the basic fact that the embryo is a semi-allograft, and that therefore it should be rejected, because if a woman were to receive, let's say, a kidney transplant from her husband, she would violently reject it in most cases, unless by mere statistical coincidence they are a match. Yet that little sucker of an embryo that is trying to implant does not get rejected. And so You like the term sucker? Okay. But what is important to understand is that this lack of rejection will only happen if the mother's immune system is normal. In other words, a normal female immune system, through mechanisms which we partially understand, but really only that little so far, a normal immune system somehow has the ability to reprogram itself from its innate response of rejecting an allograft to tolerance of that allograft. This is a basic ability of the female immune system, which is not based on a weakening of the immune system. In other words, that it's not happening because suddenly something tells the immune system, work less hard. It is a proactive response. It is the induction of specific immune pathways which allow tolerance. So it's a positive step that needs to be happening, needs to be induced. And developing tolerance, as I said, requires a normal immune system that reprograms itself from rejection to tolerance and does not become insufficient. Now, it has one other characteristic, very important characteristic. It is time limited. It is not the same kind of tolerance that needs to be introduced when somebody gets a kidney transplant or a liver transplant, which needs to last for a lifetime. This is a time tolerance of 40 weeks or 38 weeks from implantation under normal circumstances. Then it can wear off because it's no longer needed. Now, I made the point that it requires a normal immune system to induce those tolerance pathways. And I can also tell you that we now know from various observations in other fields of medicine that so-called hyperactive immune systems, and by that we mean immune systems that are activated by whatever, most frequently autoimmunity, but it can also be an inflammatory process that is not autoimmune. It even can be observed in women who are what we call at our center hyperallergenic. You know, you sometimes see those patients who are allergic to everything. Any woman who has this kind of a hyperactive immune system loses the ability to reprogram her immune system towards tolerance. She doesn't lose it completely, but she at least loses it partially. And because that tolerance development that a normally functioning immune system provides a woman who wants to conceive is not perfect, her immune system, when the embryo is trying to implant, still sees it as an allograft and therefore mounts an immune response against it. Why is this important? It is important because you need to understand, and this has been probably the single biggest misunderstanding in our field over the last 30 years, you have to understand that this immune response is not an autoimmune response. It is an alloimmune response. It is not a response against self, but the response against foreign antigen. Why is that important? Because we have, for 20 years or 30 years, concentrated on the suggested association between autoimmunity and reproductive failure, whether implantation failure or miscarriages. And superficially, that was the truth, because we saw these autoimmune abnormalities, and we saw miscarriages or implantation failures, as I showed you in my introductory slides. And it was logical to make the association that it is that autoimmunity, that thyroid disease that Andrea just spoke to you about as an example, that is causally related to implantation failure, to miscarriage, to reproductive failure in general. But that is a wrong understanding of what is really happening. The autoimmunity is just a marker. Because of the autoimmunity, or because of the inflammation, the maternal immune system cannot establish proper tolerance. So yes, you will find the autoimmune markers, but it's not the autoimmunity that causes the reaction that leads to implantation failure and miscarriages. It is the improper tolerance because of autoimmunity that leads not to an autoimmune, but to an alloimmune response. This may, you may say, what's the difference? The difference is quite significant because we treat autoimmunity and alloimmunity differently. And we have been treating for all those years, since Lube's finding of an association between autoimmunity and repeated pregnancy loss, we have been treating an autoimmune defect. We really need to develop a new paradigm here once again and start looking at this problem not as an autoimmune problem, but as an alloimmune problem. Now, why is this even important beyond what I have told you already? It is important for such conditions as preeclampsia and premature labor and other late pregnancy complications. Because I mentioned to you that, that the concept of tolerance is time limited. And what we already have known for quite a while is that when a woman develops good tolerance, her immune system switches from a so-called Th1 to a Th2 response, which is dominated by B cells, by antibody production, and certain lymphokine production, cytokine productions. Now, let me go. So, this switch takes place in every pregnancy. Recently, a study in Science, just a few months ago, reported some amazing findings. In a group of indigenous Indians in South America, where the women are in a very high percentage infected with helminth. Those are worms, parasites. One particular infection with roundworms turned out to lead to improved fertility. Guess that. Amazing observation per se, but in a way fascinating, because that parasite needs to survive inside the woman just like a fetus. Indeed, sometimes in the literature, the fetus has been described as a parasite for that reason. And so what these investigators from California found is that women who were infected with that particular parasite, they had greatly improved fecundity over controls, or even over women who were infected with other parasites. Very clearly suggesting that apparently this parasite is inducing tolerance pathways which cross over with the tolerance pathways for fertility. And maybe an even more amazing observation has been reported in a number of studies listed here in the immunization literature, far removed from our field. There are studies involving hundreds of thousands of women, different places around the world, were investigating whether influenza vaccination in pregnancy was safe. And they found it to be safe unanimously. But all of these studies made an amazing, unexpected observation. All of them. And that unexpected observation was that in women who received influenza vaccination in their pregnancy, late pregnancy complications like preeclampsia, eclampsia, and premature labor were halved, 50% reduction. Now, what does that have to do with what I've been talking about? What it has to do with is that I told you that the tolerance that is being induced by these tolerance pathways is a temporary tolerance. And women who have a hard time establishing the tolerance a priori at the beginning of the pregnancy, such as with autoimmunity, also lose the tolerance prematurely and uniformly have premature labor. How do we know that? We know that, for example, by the fact that every single autoimmune disease is statistically highly associated with premature labor. So, immune systems that have a hard time establishing tolerance, even if at some point they do establish tolerance, and I don't have the time to go into that mechanism, it's microchimerism, they also lose tolerance prematurely again. And that's where these influenza vaccinations come into play. Because the only explanation why an influenza vaccination in pregnancy could reduce premature labor, which is the single largest perinatal problem in the world, leading to over 1 million deaths a year. The only explanation is that the influenza vaccination induced or pushed, improved tolerance pathways. And in women who had a tendency towards early termination of tolerance, expanded it to normal range, and therefore their labor started at normal times. So both of these studies, which were not conducted by reproductive biologists, really strongly suggest that there are really these kind of immune pathways. So the future, we need to find and learn to define what these immune pathways are so that we can identify patients before they get pregnant and can help them induce appropriate immune pathways. And obviously, we also need to find better therapeutic treatments to suppress hyperactive immune system and or boost those tolerance pathways. And we, apropos, are just starting a prospectively randomized study at our center where we, at random, give patients influenza vaccination who have a hard time getting pregnant, thinking that if we are right in this hypothesis, then we should see in these patients quicker pregnancies and fewer miscarriages. Thank you very much.